A question I get from a lot of viewers is if carbide bandsaw blades are worth the investment. Carbide tip saw blades are expensive. There is no way around that. How expensive? Well, I have a 15-inch bandsaw with a 14-inch resaw capacity, so it takes a long 132-inch blade. This is a 1-inch wide Laguna Resaw King blade. I have used this brand for quite a while. They are not a sponsor. I buy them myself. They're also not the only brand that makes carbide blades. They're just what I use. This blade cost me, now get ready for this, $175. Of course, you probably don't have a saw that uses a blade that big, but the price for my little bit smaller Rikon saw, which took a 3/4 inch wide, 111-inch long blade, was still around $170. So for the sake of price comparison, I don't think it would be fair to compare them to the cheap general purpose high-speed steel blades that you get because the cut quality just won't be the same. The best high-speed steel comparison that I could think of may be the wood slicer, which is regarded to be of excellent quality. A high-speed steel wood slicer blade of the same size would cost you about $50. So that means that the carbide blade is about 3.5 times as expensive as a high-speed steel blade. Do they last 3.5 times as long? Yes, much longer in fact. But there is more to this subject than the blade's overall lifespan. So stick with me for a couple minutes. Since I don't sell blades, this may be the most unbiased video on the subject you're going to hear. I've used these blades quite a bit, but I've never actually dulled one to the point where it needed to be resharpened. The first carbide blade that I bought was for my older saw. I used it for a year or so, and it was still cutting like new when I replaced the saw. The new saw took a larger blade, so I had to buy another one. That blade was used for another year or so on a number of sizable resaw projects with some really hard wood before the blade broke. I'll come back to that later. So I had to get a third blade. That's what's on my saw now, and it too has been used a fair amount, and it still cuts like new. There was actually a fourth blade in there too, which ended up being the wrong size. And I procrastinated for a couple of months and then it was too late to return it. So I've bought 4 blades. I've done a ton of resawing and I've never dulled one. Of course, my situation was unique. You won't need 4 of these in your lifetime. My point is that I'm not only someone who has a lot of experience using carbide blades, but I'm also experienced in shelling out piles of cash for them. So I know how much the investment can hurt. And when I say I think they're worth the price, you know I must mean it. The reason comes down to 2 factors: overall lifespan and what I call the performance curve. How long they last obviously depends on how much you use them. If you only resaw 1 or 2 boards a year, your grandkids will be using the same blade, unless in the future they switch to lasers. But frankly, if that's all the resawing you do, you may as well just stick with your high-speed steel. I don't think in that case this investment is worth it. But if you're more like me, and you do a few projects a year which require a moderate amount of resawing through some hard woods, you should get at least a couple years before you start to notice the carbide beginning to dull. Then you send them into the factory for a $45 resharpening and you get another couple years of service or so. They can be resharpened 4 or 5 times plus the original time, so that's 4 or 5 to 6 uses. So I think you can reasonably expect a decade or more out of one of these blades. That's a long lifespan. But the most important factor to me is the performance curve. On a well-tuned bandsaw, a good, high-quality, high-speed steel resaw blade should cut as well as the carbide blade. But as any blade begins to dull, the quality begins to drop off. You get a little rougher surface as the blade struggles to keep up. That means you can't just sand, you need to run it through the planer afterwards. As it continues to dull, it starts to drift more. You can't just use your fence and push it along it. You have to steer the board through the cut so you stay near your line. Now your surface is so rough you have to go and rejoint the face between each slice. And more wood is becoming waste. When your blade was sharp, you could slice a 3/4 inch blade into equal pieces of nearly 3/8 of an inch, give or take your 32nd for your kerf. But as the blade dulls, you have to do more steering. Now you're lucky to get a couple 1/4 inch slices out of your 3/4 inch board. That can make a big difference in your project, let alone if you need thinner slices for veneers. How do you cut a 16th or an 1/8 inch veneer if your blade wanders plus or minus a 1/16 of an inch. If I'm working with very hard woods, such as oak or hickory, I start to notice a drop-off with a high-speed steel blade sometimes after 2 or 3 big slices. Before long, that resaw blade isn't good for resawing anymore because it won't track straight enough and I'm just wasting too much wood. But while a high-speed steel blade fades, the carbide keeps performing because it dulls at a much slower rate. I call that the performance curve, and it can be pretty dramatic depending on the material you're cutting. That's why you pay 3.5 times as much for these carbide tips. It's not for the convenience of replacing your blade less often. It's because the blade will do its job at a higher level rather than fading like the high-speed steel blade will. By the way, I did say I broke one of these blades. It was actually someone else in the shop who did it, so I don't know the exact circumstances. But bandsaw blades break. I've broken plenty of high-speed steel blades over the years, especially wide ones, which are stiffer and they stress more. It happens. However, Laguna offers a re-welding service for 20 bucks, so it's not a big deal. I just have to get around to sending it in to them. Again, Laguna's not a sponsor. I buy my own blades, but I will never go back to high-speed steel for resawing. In my opinion, if you do a fair amount of this kind of work, the carbide blade is worth every cent. In fact, over time, it is actually a lot cheaper than the good high-speed steel ones. I'll put a link to them below this video if you want to check them out. Before I go, I should mention, because I know people are going to ask in the comments, are these blades for regular curve cutting? The answer is no. They only make them, I think, 1/2 inch is the narrowest you can get them. So they're just for resawing, not for curve cutting. See you next time. I've been using Duragrit carbide sanding products for years, and I still haven't worn out the first ones I bought. If I have a rough edge to smooth, a corner to chamfer, or a curve to shape, more often than not, I'm reaching for one of these cleverly designed tools. It's one of those workshop secrets I wish I'd discovered long ago. Check out the link below this video to see for yourself.